Good evening, everyone. My name is Fred Lee. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement at the University of British Columbia. It is absolutely my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's installment of UBC Dialogues, Baiting, Selling, Telling. Is there still a place for objective journalism? So usually at this point, you may hear, or we would encourage you to turn off your cell phones, but not tonight. Just put them on silent because we would love for you to tweet the event. The Twitter handle is @AlumniUBC. The hashtag is UBC Dialogues, all one word. Tonight as well, we'll be using a very cool audience engagement platform that we have implemented over the past couple of years to engage everyone in the conversation. So if you happen to have a mobile device, a smartphone, laptop, tablet, please take 30 seconds right now to take that device out and go to alumniubc.cnf.io. And I believe the URL is being projected on the screen. We'll give you a few moments to log on. Again, alumniubc.cnf.io. This audience engagement platform will allow you to ask questions and comment in real time throughout this evening's conversation. Other attendees can light your question, and when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening, our moderator will endeavor to pose the top questions from this audience to our esteemed panel. So again, that URL is alumniubc.cnf.io. If any of you have attended the TED Talks, they just introduced this platform this past year. So for a trial run, you will note we have populated a polling question related to tonight's conversation. Is it possible to be objective with sponsored content and advertisements? Please take this time now to answer our poll. It will give a bit of a barometer, or provide a barometer for our panel and moderator. It's almost kind of split right now. You're still logging in. But as you can see, that's where we're going to be starting, and perhaps by the end of the evening, our panel will sway you one way or the other. So why UBC Dialogues? Our alumni have consistently told us they want to make a positive impact in their community and around the world. They want opportunities to connect with one another and with UBC. They want to hear from UBC on issues that matter to them where they live, work, and play. So this evening we will hear from alumni, faculty members, and community experts who are leaders in their field who will tackle tonight's topic. This conversation will be podcast at alumni.ubc.ca, and you may have noticed there's a camera in the back. Videotape conversation will also be made available on the Irving K. Barber Digital Library, and that's at ubc.ca. So while we have the privilege of enjoying this conversation tonight, this conversation will be made available to our 307,000 alumni wherever they may reside in the world. So on behalf of UBC, I would like to now take this opportunity to thank the speakers, the moderator, for their time and talent. It is now my pleasure to introduce Scotiabank's Mary Stoychevsky, branch manager at Broadway and Burrard, to introduce our moderator for the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, from Scotiabank, one of our fine supporters, Mary Stoychevsky.
Thanks, Fred, and I guess I'm too tall for this. Thank you. Thanks, Fred, and good evening, everyone. I am thrilled to be here tonight to welcome you all to UBC Dialogues. Scotiabank is committed to supporting the communities in which we live and work, and like UBC Dialogues, we believe that different ideas and perspectives contribute to strong and healthy society, and one that fosters an inclusive culture, and one that celebrates talent and diversity. Scotiabank is proud to partner with our friends at UBC on this fantastic series of events. Tonight we are in for a real treat, as we'll hear from another outstanding lineup of panelists, and it's my pleasure to welcome our moderator for the evening, Karen Burgess. Karen Burgess has been the executive producer for news at CBC Vancouver since June 2015. She now not only oversees the television but also radio and online news coverage as well. Previously, Karen was the senior producer for the 180, a national current affairs show hosted by Jim Brown, as well as producing such shows as The Early Edition with Rick Clough and On the Coast with Stephen Quinn. Karen has developed and produced many fixed-run national current affairs shows featuring everything from economics to country music. Due to Karen's extensive experience and success, she now trains other producers as part of CBC's Putting It All Together course, aimed at digital radio and television producers. Karen has recently voted as one of BC's Business's Most Influential Women 2016. To guide us along in tonight's dialogue, please join me in a warm welcome for our moderator, Karen Burgess.
Thank you, everybody, for the warm welcome. I really appreciate it, and I am absolutely thrilled to be taking part in what is going to be a very interesting conversation. Get me talking about journalism and all of the ins and outs, and I will completely nerd out on this. So I'm so thrilled to have the incredible insights and thoughts and opinions and experience in the House to share, because there's a lot of tough questions that we're going to be asking, and I'm glad that these guys are going to be answering them and not me. But since being invited to take part in this, I've been thinking a lot about the speed at which news travels these days and how technology is changing who can broadcast to the world and what that means for journalists in terms of their craft and their responsibility to the public. And it put me in mind of an experience that I had about 15 years ago. I was asked to go to New York in the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks. And so I was providing coverage for that event. I was working with a host named Philip Till, who, previous to coming to Vancouver, had spent most of his career as a foreign correspondent for NBC. And so he had been in all the far-flung places in the world, bullets whizzing overhead, scorpion bites, shady characters, all of this sort of thing. So he was a real pro. He had done all of this a million times. So we were there in New York, and it was just a day or two after the Twin Towers fell, and you could still smell the smoke in the air. And we went to Ground Zero, and of course, the station that I was working for at the time asked for a number of live reports, as did all of the stations across our network. And so we just had a cell phone, and we were there at this bus shelter, and it was absolutely plastered with missing persons posters, because at that time the storyline had evolved to the point where we knew this thing had happened and we knew people were missing, but all of these families had yet to find any kind of closure on what was going on. And so Philip was there, and he did this whole string of live reports talking about what we could see and what we could smell and what we could hear and the people that we had talked to. And when he was done, he handed me back the cell phone. It was a pretty low-tech kind of thing back then, 15 years ago. It didn't even take pictures. But he handed the phone back to me, and he said, "You know, it didn't used to be like that in journalism." And I don't think I quite got what he meant, but he had these stories about the places where he had been a reporter. And 15 years previous to 9/11, when he was reporting on the Middle East, he would go out for days at a time with his crew. And you would gather all this information, and then you'd come back to whatever American-style hotel it was that they inevitably put you up in as a reporter, and you would hope to get your film into the hands of somebody who could get it back to New York. And you'd ask the hotel porter, "Can you get me a phone line?" And it would take hours to get connected back to the world. And during that time, he said, you'd sit in the restaurant and you'd think, and you'd have your dinner. And then you'd sit in the lounge and you'd start writing, and you'd think about all the elements that needed to be included in that story to tell the whole story to your audience. And then you'd rewrite it again, and then you'd rewrite it again, and then eventually that phone line would actually be connected because such was technology at the time. And he said, you know, it didn't used to just be a guy standing in a bus shelter with a phone. And he said, I don't know that we all have time to think enough about the journalism because the speed of it now, it's so instantaneous. And I'm sure that I scoffed a little bit at that point. Philip Till, who I love dearly, is a friend of mine, but a bit of a Luddite. He was still using a typewriter at that point in his career, but it sort of stuck with me. And then flash forward 15 years on, I was just walking through our newsroom at the CBC a few days ago, and I saw our social media reporter periscoping something live that was happening in the newsroom, literally broadcasting something unfiltered to the world that was happening. And I thought, oh, I don't think it used to be like that in journalism. And it made me think about all of the questions that we're going to be talking about tonight. If you broadcast something with no editing, live, it's happening right now, and I can show the entire world, is that completely objective because I haven't edited it or changed it in some way? It got me thinking. So I'm, as I said, now going to ask all kinds of tough questions to the panel that we have here. But it does seem like there has never been a time before that information has traveled quite as quickly as it does now. With all the easy access we have to the production tools that traditionally belong to a network like CBC or NBC, you can do it with your phone now. So what does that mean? People are contributing to the process in a different way, but as consumers of news and information, how do we know what's behind that? Is it the public interest? Has it been vetted in some way? Or is there an interest behind it, like a political point of view, an advertising objective? Is there an editorial agenda that's going on? So how do we test that out for ourselves as consumers? And quite frankly, if consumers are looking for opinion and editorial, then as journalists, do we still want to produce a product that we consider to be objective? So these are some of the questions that we're going to get to tonight. And I hope that you will all participate fully. I expect that some of the best questions are going to be coming from you, both on that audience engagement tool, which looks really neat and I'm excited to interact with, but also hoping that you will raise your hand and speak to the runners in the audience who will have microphones to help you participate as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. I'll invite you fine folks to the stage now, and as they are coming to join us for this conversation, I will give you all an introduction to each of them one by one so that you'll know a little bit about the people who are taking part. So first off, Farhan Mohammed. He is the editor-in-chief of Vancity Buzz. He's been a partner in the website since its early days and controls the day-to-day operations of the company and the content creation. Farhan first got a taste of the life of the media working for the Vancouver Sun and the province, and since then he says his passion is to change the way people consume news and to continue the evolution of Vancity Buzz as a dynamic and multifaceted digital news source. Today, Farhan leads the editorial arm of Vancity Buzz, which has grown its readership by over 15 times since he began, along with Calgary Buzz, which was the company's 2015 expansion. Farhan Mohammed. Valerie Castleton is our next panelist, next to Farhan. She's the associate editor of integrated projects for the Pacific Newspaper Group, working with both the Vancouver Sun and the province. She's responsible for special series, publications, and projects, which the newsroom publishes both online and in the papers. As a senior editor, Valerie works with management on the management team of The Sun on daily news gathering as well as strategic initiatives. And she has helped transform the newspaper into a multimedia newsroom operating 24/7 and publishing one of the fastest growing news websites in Canada. Valerie is also an alumnus here at UBC and has always kept her close ties to the university, having served on the alumni UBC board of directors as well as on numerous advisory boards and committees. Valerie. Next up, Paul Watson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of 2 books, including the best-selling memoir, Where War Lives. He spent much of his over 25 years in journalism as a foreign correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and the Toronto Star. He recently resigned as the Star's multimedia Arctic correspondent, saying the newspaper was refusing to run a story about the Conservative government's use of the search for Sir John Franklin's missing ships to push its own political agenda. He is currently writing Ice Ghosts, the epic hunt for the lost Franklin expedition, and is also the subject of an award-winning 2-man play called The Body of an American, which is being staged at New York's Cherry Lane Theatre. And if you happen to be there, you can catch that until March 20th. Paul. And our 4th panelist for the evening is Steve Woodward. We have 2 Pulitzer Prize winners in the crowd. Steve is also a Pulitzer Prize winner. He has joined the UBC Graduate School of Journalism faculty for this academic year. He began his career at the Kansas City Star and was part of the team which won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the 1981 Hyatt Regency Hotel Skywalk collapse, which killed 113 people. Steve was editor and reporter at the Oregonian for 20 years, winning a National Headliner Award for coverage of the Enron scandal, and several awards as well for his coverage of the first Roman Catholic Archdiocese bankruptcy in the wake of priest sex abuse scandals. And as if all of that wasn't enough, he is also named the Journalist of the Year, Oregon's Journalist of the Year by the U.S. Small Business Administration for his coverage of the Y2K computer crisis. Please join me now in welcoming Steve. So before we dive into the main topic of discussion, I'll just give you a few more details about the format of the discussion tonight. I'm going to be asking our panelists a number of questions, and that's going to take about 25 or 30 minutes. And then it's over to you, so full participation is required. And that will be for the audience-driven question and answer period. The evening is going to finish with a reception, and we invite you to continue the conversation one-on-one with our panelists there. And as a reminder, we are recording this as the evening's dialogue is going to be made available on the UBC Alumni Digital Library. All right, you guys ready? Mm-hmm. Fabulous. So we are talking tonight about whether there is still a place for objective journalism. But I think the first question that I would need to ask all of you is, what does objective actually mean to you? You can tell I had some questions about it. Journalists are people too. So in the choices that we make about what we choose to point our cameras at, the people we choose to put our microphones up to, the facts that we choose to include in a story, we're all using our values and the values of the organizations that we might represent. So does that mean we are not objective? Simply giving equal weight to 2 opinions isn't necessarily enough to balance a piece of journalism. So how do you pin it down? So that's going to be the opening question for all of you. And Farhan, perhaps we'll start with you. How do you define objectivity in journalism? Is it an absolute? Is it a spectrum?
Yeah, so it's funny, so I was talking with our team a little bit, and I'm going to keep it as simple as possible, otherwise I'm going to start rambling on and on and on, and I will take up the whole half hour. To me, it's trying to be as unbiased as possible, but at the same time you're also throwing weight into what you think is important. I think for us and what we do is we try to look at what is interesting to us, important to us, what's going to have the interest of our readers at the same time. So it's looking at it and saying, how do we choose what is going to be the facts, but at the same time weighing those facts out and figuring out what's important out of all of those, and really keeping it as simple as possible and breaking it down. I think it's taking real issues and making it accessible for everyday people, that it's easy for them to understand, and it's our job to to really choose what they want to see. So in a way, it's unbiased, but it's biased at the same time. It's looking at it and saying, this is what we think is important, and this is what we hope you think is important. It's very gray to me and what we do, and I'm sure it's going to be very different answers coming from the other side.
All right. Well, thank you for kicking things off with that. Let's see how different the answers are as we go along. Valerie, what's your take on objectivity?
I think objective journalism is fact-based journalism. It's rooted in research, in data, and in truth. And I think that it's as much a process, and it's as much a process and about people as it is those things I've just mentioned. I think that it is it's the pursuit of truth and fact that is done by educated people, trained journalists, people who have a system of accountability. They work within a system of accountability, and what they find out is verifiable. And so in the case of media, like where we work or where we've been trained and where we're training, it's a system where you have reporters who come into the system and they're well trained, and then there's a whole series of checks and balances to make sure that they're asked questions like, how do you know this? Where did you find this out? Who is your source? How many sources do you have? And that you name your sources, and that you're very, very clear and transparent with your reader. So I think that's probably as close as I can get at this point, and then we'll explore the subtleties as we go on through the evening.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Paul, what definition of objectivity would you like to get on the table?
I think it's an attempt to be fair, an attempt to bring in conflicting views on whatever subject or event or issue you're writing or reporting on. It also involves being an observer, not a participant. So you're not an activist. You're not beating a drum on behalf of some hidden agenda. But having said all of that, I will say I've spent most of my life, adult life, trying to be objective, only to realize that human beings fail at it. And so what it becomes, and especially in the age we live in, forgive me if there are marketers or political consultants or others in the audience, but there are more of those than there are journalists. So we live in an age when people who are very good at this are working very hard to manipulate public opinion. And if I, as a journalist, approach a story simply reporting he said, she said, my readers are going to be left wondering who's telling the truth. So Val made a good point. Objectivity must include the truth, or what's the point? So I come to point of view, which I prefer, and I think we can discuss this. But other forms of journalism, magazines, documentary filmmaking, allow a point of view, and I'm not suggesting that's lazy opinion, which I don't like, but if a journalist has spent a significant amount of time gathering facts, checking all sides, or as many as possible, etc., and puts in the hard work and comes up with a point of view, I think that gets you closer to the truth than simply making 2 phone calls and putting conflicting views in one story and leaving it up for you to decide.
All right. Thank you. That leaves you, Steve.
I think there are 2 schools of thought about objectivity. Either it exists or it doesn't really exist. And I'm actually of the latter school. I mean, like Paul and the others on the panel, I've spent most of my career trying to be objective. But when you really try to pin down what that means, it's a very elusive term. We're all humans. Objectivity is something that is supposedly representing reality. And those of you who are old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, he ended every newscast with, and that's the way it is. And at that time, what Walter said it was it. That was the truth with a capital T. I think what we're experiencing now is that there can be some, if people believe we're objective, I think they can look at coverage of controversial issues like climate change and gay rights and human rights, women's rights. You look back over these things, and the way journalists have covered them over the ages has changed from trying to include all the sides of an issue to the point today where a lot of us are agreed that there is no other side. And you see that reflected in coverage, and that, in a way, to me, is not objective. I think it's right, but I really don't think it's objective. And I'll shut up in a minute, but the Society of Professional Journalists in the United States has a code of ethics, and is probably the most widely copied in the world. 20 years ago this year, they removed the word objective from the code of ethics because they couldn't pin it down. And they replaced it with fairness, truth, honesty, accuracy, words like that. To me, objectivity is an institutional goal. The other words are goals, are the way you describe people, the way you trust people. And I think journalists are subjective. I can't look at reality through my 62 years of experience and say it's the same reality that you see. So I guess I'm falling on the opposite end of the scale. I don't think there is objectivity.
Interesting. So we have a couple of people saying that there isn't, and that you were saying that you want to put your values out there and say to your audience that you share those values, and you hope that you're having kind of a conversation. And I heard you guys mention, Valerie, you mentioned that journalists need to be trained professionals, and you mentioned the Professional Society of Journalists, I think it was, in the States. I wonder, what is the role then of a citizen journalist, who is somebody who presumably would be rooted in that community and that that value system that you're hoping to have a conversation with, and would be very different from those people who perhaps went to journalism school, took a degree, had an ethics class, for example. How does the role of citizen journalism fit into this discussion about objectivity?
I think citizen journalists, by definition, are citizens who aren't necessarily trained in journalism. And the same as all of us, all of our friends, all of our colleagues, people we talk with every day, some are more informed than others are informed. I think that, people often wonder, well, who should I believe? And I think that when you're reading copious amounts of content from different sources, you learn over time who you can trust, and perhaps whose views are the same as your own views. I think that objectivity is something, if it's fact-based, of course everyone is then going to bring their reporting, but you have to make sure that the point of view that you espouse, or the content that you put out there, the stories that you write, are based in some kind of factual knowledge. If you want to write about the budget, you have to get the numbers straight. You have to knowledgeably understand what the numbers in the budget are saying to you. If you want to talk about taxation in the city, you have to understand what all the layers are. You have to know where to get the data. You have to understand all the different corresponding forces that are at play. And I think you're right. And then there are different interpretations that would be placed on that. So it's pretty complex, right?
I come from a background of war reporting primarily. There's no better covered conflict in human history, I think, than Syria, but it's all on YouTube. And it's not mostly on YouTube. Most of the detailed visual coverage of what's going on there, you have to go and look for it. And it's shot on cell phones, smartphones, by citizen journalists. And not a one of them is objective. They are able to give you raw video of the aftermath of a bombing or something, but they are very emotionally involved in what they're doing. Now, when you use the YouTube examples, there are other professional journalists down the food chain who will take that stuff out without knowing anything about who shot it. constantly on the nightly news or on the radio, you'll know this, you'll have a voiced piece out of London from your correspondent, and what they're doing is lifting stuff from activists and others off of other sources because they're not in Syria. Oftentimes they can't be there. So you end up with this muddle of professional journalism and citizen journalism all wrapped together. And to call it objective, I mean, your CBC standards or any network standards would be this is objective, but really it isn't. And that, I think the end result is it's up to the consumer to be an activist consumer. You can't be, Walter Cronkite's a great example. You can't comfortably sit in your armchair anymore and say, feed me. You have to challenge and think and ask questions and search. And you'll figure out what, as you said, Val, you'll figure out what you trust. But, as someone who's been on the inside for a long time, don't trust a lot of it. Challenge it.
It's interesting in today's world that there's so much available, so much media available, so much content available, and I wonder how it was like decades ago, because I don't know that there's so many things available today that local publications, national outlets, even some international ones, that you're looking at the content they're providing you, and there's some people who take it as fact. And so I guess my question to you would be, how has that changed over the past few decades?
That's exactly right. All that's changed is that there are more sources, which is a good thing. That allows you, as I get older, I make the mistake of quoting Donald Rumsfeld a lot, but he was right when he said, you don't know what you don't know. And I'll change it and say, you don't know what they're not telling you. And that's where the lie is in much of the media today. There's a lot of things that journalists know that they're not telling you. And the only difference, that's the key question, the only difference is transparency, in my mind. So with all of the sources that are available now, you can figure out what they're not telling you. You can go to Intercept, for instance, and find out through their investigative reporting what the Washington Post isn't telling you. Or, you can figure this stuff out. So then you get to the point of trust. People have trusted the mainstream media for a long time. Our generation, maybe the one after it, but the younger generation doesn't. The numbers are clear. Why don't they trust them? Because they know they're not telling them the whole truth.
I think that's why transparency is such a big deal in media today.
Right.
And even like on the issue of citizen journalism and citizen journalists, I think it's, our outlet has been under scrutiny for the past many number of years, that we have people who have no idea what they're doing. But in fact, we have people who are doing the exact same things, that have boxes that you need to check, you have sources that you need to get confirmation from, and you have to do all those things. So I think it's changed also that you have people who are trained, you have people who know the right thing to do, but then again it changes from, it takes you away from objectivity, that's not objective anymore. It's subjective to what you think is right and what your editors think is right and what the outlet thinks is right.
I have a couple of thoughts on this. First thing is about citizen journalism. I think we're misusing the term a lot. I think of them as people with cameras. I don't think of them as citizen journalists, because they aren't really trying to do journalism. They're taking a picture and posting it. Journalists, as Valerie so eloquently put it, they verify, they're questioned about whether they've got the facts, whether they're complete. There's a whole discipline that journalists follow, even though I insist that they can't be objective. The goal is to be objective. So there are disciplines you can follow, rules you can follow to try to get as close to that as possible, because we're all fallible human beings. So, and citizen journalists, for the most part, do not do that. So I don't agree with that term at all. As far as looking back several decades, the change is the internet, pure and simple. We used to have a system where all of our institutions were in charge. news, like Walter Cronkite, news was what my editor said it was. News was what I got assigned to do. And you guys got the newspaper or turned on the TV, and that's what you got. That's what we decided to feed you. The internet changed that. You can now click to something else. The power dynamic has shifted. So whereas the media used to be the central power, the power now has shifted to the audience. As a result, we're just trying to get your attention. I mean, we're left on the outside, and I think that is the fundamental change. And because the cost of productions come down, I mean, the difference is that you used to have to own a TV station or own a set of presses in order to reach people. And now you just, you get a GoDaddy account and you can be a journalist. So that's why you have a proliferation.
Well, and I wonder about that, to the question that my colleague raised there 15 years ago about the impact that he saw on technology and the amount of care that he was able to put into reporting and making sure that it was objective and balanced. What do you see as the impact of those gathering technologies, not just the internet by which we disseminate, but the impact on the gathering technologies on objectivity and how we craft our stories and how we balance them?
I think the gathering is really interesting. I wish I had all this stuff available to me when I was a journalist. I left the field in 2008, took a buyout when the Oregonian was starting to reduce its staff. So I didn't really benefit a whole lot from what's out there now, but I teach my students all sorts of ways to use Facebook, Twitter, all those things for reporting purposes, because there is a lot of information. What you have to do is also learn how to vet it. And there are organizations like Storyful or others that use technology to verify whether social media information is correct or not. And we're seeing more and more powerful technological tools that can ferret out fake photos, rumors. There's so much that's now coming online. It's been hard, but I think that's changing now.
The thing that, I'll flip it around. What I like about the technology is that it frees up people to now hold journalists to account. So there's much more active pushback. Canada Land is the example I keep thinking of, because in Canada it's great. They're really holding some important institutions' feet to the fire, and sadly, journalists are turning out to have very thin skins. That we're really good at holding corporate leaders or politicians to account, but when someone challenges us, we don't answer the phone call, or we refuse to be interviewed, or we do all the things that
I disagree with you.
Well,
carry on.
Right. So the point I was going to make is that, to me, the vibrancy of the internet, the technology, forces journalists to establish trust through transparency. And we need more of that. You should have a personal relationship with your journalist. And trust me, I hope, if you knew a lot of the people who you're getting your information from, you wouldn't get your information from them. And journalists need to be a lot more open about who they are and what their biases are and what political parties they support and all of that. Put it all out there, and then you can pick and choose.
I think you're right, Paul, but I think that is happening. I think everything is out there, and there has never been so much transparency, so much hidden, and so many people being called to account. One of the things that we were asked to think about, I think, when we attended tonight was the growth of social media and all of these new forms of getting the message out there, and whether or not that has had a negative effect on objectivity and you can't have fair reporting. That actually has made fair reporting and objective reporting more possible in some ways, because there's so many places you can check and cross-check. There are so many people weighing in, so many people saying, well, think about this and think about that. And I think the actual delivery methods and the platforms in themselves, they're not part of the problem, but you have to always consider what is the source of the material that is going onto that platform. platform? What is it that's being amplified out there? Where did it come from? What's the very beginning? And then you come back to, who do you trust and who, who's producing the material, right? Writers today, I think, have probably never worked as hard. I remember back in the day when we had multiple editions of the paper and you had to write your story, then you had to get more comment, you had to rewrite it, and you were writing for the morning and then you were writing for the evening. So it was very busy. But now reporters are doing all that. They're updating in real time throughout the day. They're tweeting out. They're watching their Twitter accounts and they're looking to see what the reaction is, and they're often engaging with their readers. Meanwhile, they're preparing for tomorrow's newspaper to be put out. They're being told to shoot video, and they do, and increasingly there's more and more apps so that they can learn to shoot video quickly and effectively. So they're thinking in terms of, how do I tell this story with image? I mean, it's crazy out there, but you have to figure who's the source, and sometimes that's the organization, that's the source that's producing it, sometimes it's the individuals. Over time, I think a smart media consumer learns who they can trust, and they learn who is going to be sifting and interpreting and come to the conclusions that they might come to.
But I wonder too, though, you speak about Twitter and social media particularly. We know that people are engaged on social media by personalities and by opinion and by color and not necessarily straight facts. So are we asking journalists, because we ask them, of course, to break news first and get it out there on Twitter, are we asking them to be sort of two things in this new social media sphere? Have, a personality and really engage with people on a personal level, because that's what Twitter is all about, and social media and Facebook, but also maintain this standard of fairness and objectivity. Do you see any tension, I guess, between those two things?
I don't see a tension between. I think young people today are all of those things. They're interacting in lightning speed on all of those different levels. Sorry, you're...
No, go ahead. I did have a thought about, yes, it's tough to do the institutional part. Institutions have always been the voice of God. I mean, that's how journalism has been for the last, I don't know how many 100 years, that we broadcast, we speak to a captive audience, but people are not trusting of institutions anymore. It's a different kind of world. Institutions have let people down. And part of that is the internet. I mean, we've gone from, I look at the internet in 3 different development phases. Where it first formed, it was just institutions connecting to each other, military to universities or whatever, connecting their computer networks to each other. Then there was the web in 1990, and that linked up pages. So you could click on a link and go to somebody else's page and see that. But social media revolutionized it by actually connecting human beings to each other. And that was the turning point for the internet. And it made the human being the center point of the internet in a way that had never been before. So then news becomes what your friends think is news. And on Facebook, the way you read news isn't necessarily that you read the Vancouver Sun, although I hope you all subscribe to the Vancouver Sun and read it, and the Province. But if they have a good story that somebody likes, they're going to post it on Facebook and it gets shared. So if you want to read good journalism, my advice is find better friends.
I have an idea which anyone's free to steal because I'm busy, but it's called Pundit Watch. If you took the main pundits in this country on CBC or CTV or wherever, Globe and Mail, and had a rating system, just find the things that you can check 6 months later or a year later, and figure out who has a good record and who has a bad record. That would be a good public service, and you can figure out, the truth is a lot of pundits are simply political consultants who have a hidden agenda because they represent a political party or a faction. And when they're presented to you as a columnist or as a commentator. They aren't. They're shills for some hidden interest. A pundit watch is an easy way to tell the consumer, I've rated this person. This is how right they are, how wrong they are. And the more we get of that sort of thing, the more we'll start cutting through the so-called objective journalism, getting to the nugget of the truth.
Ariane, one question to you.
I think just on the topic of social media, I think the only disadvantage or the one bad thing that I don't like about it and that I see is that everything has to be in lightning speed right now. So if there's a story breaking, you have to get that story out within minutes. You have to get that story up right away versus, all right, you have half an hour, you have an hour, you have time to make your phone calls, you have time to put out emails. And in that sense, that's what I've seen change. Before, speed wasn't as much of a factor. You still needed to get it done, but there weren't as many people on social, so you knew that it wasn't going to be seen right away. So you knew you had some time. Versus today, where everyone's on that same story right away, everyone's trying to do the same thing, and just the speed of it has changed it. That you have to get stories done within minutes. And I know our newsroom has changed from, all right, just make sure you've gotten that done within half an hour or an hour, to now you have 5 minutes to get that story done. You have 5 minutes to make that call, and like, where's that call? Why isn't it coming in? And where's that next call? Like, everything is just at that speed. And in my eyes, that's what is going to be the downfall of many publications and outlets, because everything has to move at that speed that mistakes are made. And you're not taking the time to verify information correctly.
But you also correct them in real time.
Yep.
So it's a rolling kind of reporting. 24 hours, it gets bigger or shorter, or you add in things, you take stuff out, you fix it. So the objectivity is not judged a Tuesday morning on a Monday story. It's judged by the minute. It can still be objective and still be accurate, but it changes as it goes. I find that exciting. That's real-time reporting.
All right.
There's a pushback movement against the quickness. So you have a movement that's called slow journalism that is starting to emerge, like slow food. And one of the practitioners is something called Delayed Gratification Magazine. It comes out every 3 months. It arrives in print in your mailbox, and it tackles issues in depth. But there are also other websites that do that. There's one called News Deeply, and there's one website they started called Syria Deeply and Arctic Deeply. So they'll take one issue at a time, and that entire issue is just devoted to as deep a dive as they can make into that subject. So it's interesting. There is backlash against the quickness of social media, although they still use social media to get their word out.
You need both.
Yes.
Well, I have some questions that have come in on the audience engagement interface here, and also at this point I would like to invite you guys, if you have questions in the audience, as I understand it, if you raise your hand, we do have folks out there with microphones who will come to you. But I'll start just with a question that's sort of related to what you were talking about, the idea of a magazine that publishes once every 3 months and then really takes a deep dive. There has to be a business case for that. So I'll take this first question from the audience. Is it really possible to fact check and ensure appropriate checks and balances and objectivity is in place when newsrooms have been gutted and budgets aren't the same as they used to be? Who would like to take that one on?
I might, because maybe my gutted newsroom that people are talking about. But gutted is relative too, because if you had 200 or 300 reporters a few years ago, do you have to have that number? I don't really think you do. And I think that people are working much more efficiently, really, nowadays. Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, is it possible to fact check and ensure that appropriate checks and balances are in place and objectivity is maintained when newsrooms are being gutted?
It depends on the story, and I think you can have team fact checking if you're working on a budget, for example. You would have a number of people working on it, right? If it's a newspaper, then you're publishing on a number of different platforms. So you publish quickly. If you're doing social media, that would be highlights. And then you're checking and rechecking and rechecking and writing a story for the next day. And then you may be doing a feature for later in the week as well, right? So you work within whatever it is that you're selling to your clients, your readers.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I had a revelation. I have these from time to time. I realized that the public's understanding of truth and accuracy is different than a journalist. By and large, journalists think that if I phone 4 people and I accurately write down or record what each one of them says, and I have it all right, that it's accurate. The public expects what they read to be accurate and truthful. In other words, if one of the 4 people I interviewed is just wrong, and they quoted dates of history or facts of science or something, and they were wrong, and I didn't check it, the public thinks my story is wrong. I think it's right, because that's what people told me. The public's obviously right. Now, that level of fact-checking in a newspaper has never been done, and never will be done. It can't be done. It would take, that's magazine-level fact-checking. We call it error at source. Now, if the editor calls me up and says, we got a complaint on your story, this, and this is wrong. I say error at source, I'm off the hook. That's just not right. Now, the better answer is fixing it as we go. Tell the public, look, there's mistakes all over the place. We fix it as we go. Every 20 minutes or whatever, it's updated. You tell us what's wrong. It's sort of like a wiki relationship. If you're an expert, you tell me there's a mistake in the story, we'll fix it. And so it's a rolling sort of journalism. And then the public, we're transparent. The public knows there's mistakes coming all over the place for many different reasons. But we'll get it right as we go. Then the public's engaged and we're being honest about it.
And if you make a mistake, you
Sure, we're
own up
honest
to
about
it,
it.
you do a set straight, or you write another story.
We're all trying to get to the same place.
Yeah.
But that's not what we have now. We have this sort of ivory tower attitude of we don't make mistakes, and we'll begrudgingly admit to a mistake, but only if the reporter made it, not if the source made it. Well, that's nonsense. The public wants to be able to trust what they're reading. So we gotta get everyone involved and be transparent and say we're gonna fix it as we go.
Yeah, a lot of it, I think, now is you're seeing sausage being made, and it's not pretty. I mean, a daily paper used to have 24 hours to get the story right. I mean, and gather all the facts, think about it, write it carefully, structure your story, have it go through several editors, the copy desk, and I think that's a good question. With newsrooms reduced, there's only so much that you can do. I mean, human beings can only do so much, right? So something has to give. But you can look at newsroom processes. What I think of is that all the follow-up stories I've done, you know, something breaks and then follow-up after follow-up, and each one of those stories I do from scratch. I pull all the clips from before and I rewrite the whole damn thing, right? So it's new each time. There have been some attempts now to use technology. A thing called Circa, which is no longer in existence, a Canadian company, tried to do this by creating what they called news atoms. So you would call it up on your mobile phone, and there would be the story would keep building each time. So each new development would come in as a paragraph or a map or something on the top, and you'd have all the background right there. So it reduced the amount of fact-checking, reporting, writing that needed to be done. And yet it was a complete story. So I think there are some ways that we can probably adjust newsroom flow using technology, but it's not easy.
I think, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's also easier to fact check when you have the world of knowledge at your fingertips,
Yeah.
too. So that's a help, right? That's something we didn't have 30 years ago.
I remember my first job at CBC was, when I was going to university, was the just wondering questions. I was the summer intern, and you'd answer but that was before there was Google, and so you'd call the radio station and ask them, I'm just wondering, what can you do with banana peels? And there was no internet.
How did you guys live back then?
I don't know. It was very difficult.
Just one piggybacking on that, when I left the Oregonian in 2008, with a buyout, as I said, but the number of people who walked out that day, last day, they calculated, walked out with 4,000 years of experience. And that is not replaceable. I don't care. You know, you're hiring in younger people to do it. You can't, that's 4,000 years of experience in fact-checking that they just have in their heads.
I think we have a question from the audience. Sorry, I'm looking directly into a light. Hi.
Yes, you're talking about media and reporting from your point of view, hardly surprising, but in being a receiver of the news where I'm getting it in 15-second sound bites because it's coming so quickly, and the time spent to read in depth just isn't there, you're dealing with issues like primacy and recency. The first thing you hear is what you fix on, and if it's wrong, there's never going to be a second glance. The other thing that happens is that you believe the last thing you heard, and you never get the rolling story. I mean, you guys might be doing a really good job on doing a rolling story. I'm not spending my life watching you update your stories. I'm going on with my life trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So what does all this technology do to the reader? I mean, does he read a story differently now than they used to?
Thank you for that question.
You're absolutely right, but recognize that a revolution is underway. All the hope and shouting at the wind won't stop it. So that stuff's coming at you. And it's going to be up to you to figure out whether you want to check it out again. And it's a matter of gradation. If you read on your cell phone today that there's been, God forbid, some catastrophic event happened in the middle of Vancouver, that's probably going to get your attention. You'll want to check that. If you read some celebrity news that's of little interest to you, who cares whether that's right or wrong? The important stuff you're going to check. And the fact is that it's going to be out there as instantly as someone can get it out there. And if it's wrong, that's just the revolution we live in. It can't be stopped.
The news industry uses something called eye track studies. And before the internet, they would look at what people actually looked at when they looked at a newspaper front page. So they went from the photo to a headline to the photo caption to a subhead. The very last thing anybody read was the actual story. And there they only read maybe one paragraph or two. The way they read the story on the internet now, and I teach web writing because you got to be aware of this stuff, is they'll read the headline first, they'll read the first 3 words of the headline and the last 3 words of the headline. So it's what you're talking about. And then they scan down the left side of the page and they read the first 8 characters that they see. If something catches their eye, they'll read more, but not much. So that's how it's changed.
So when you say it's up to me to go and dig deep and figure out what I believe because you guys are feeding it to me, it changes the nature of our democracy hugely. Because
Absolutely.
while I might go and do that on one little narrow issue that I'm really interested in, there's going to be a lot of people that aren't doing that, and I'm not doing it on all issues.
Right, and that you've hit it on the head, and that's the question you touched on earlier. How is this different? It isn't different. I want to be open to you and tell you that all the stuff you've believed up until the point of the revolution, you trusted, you shouldn't have trusted. All you're finding out now is that you shouldn't have trusted that stuff. Now you can get engaged. Now you can find out where they're fooling you. And that you are absolutely right. Our democracy, young people need to be taught. Don't believe what you hear. Challenge it.
But all of these threads are coming back to your point, which is how do I know what to believe and primacy, etc. It's where is the source? Ask yourself what the source is. Everyone should know what is at the source of the funnel where they're getting this information. I mean, we were all watching the Oscars, and there was this discussion about the whitewashing of the Oscars, right? And everybody is like outraged, and there's not enough representation of black people in the nominations and in the award system, right? The Economist stood back, listened to the roar on social media elsewhere, and then they did an analysis, and what they found is that if you look at the time periods that the Academy Awards have been given out, like since the year 2000, for example, there have actually been proportionately more Academy Awards given out to people who are black and African American than than the actual population of black and African Americans in America. So, the Economist kind of went, oh, like, look at the numbers and look where the discussion should be. And what they said is the discussion actually should be around Hispanics and non-black, non-white, because they're horribly underrepresented. But guess what? It was the Economist. They took the time to do the deep dive, right? So source. It has that's how you find out, and that's how you get the information that you need to be an intelligent consumer of news in a democracy. Source.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm just mindful that there may be other folks in the audience who have a question to ask, and we want to make sure we get a couple more in.
Hello. My question is mostly for Farhan. So Farhan, I wanted to ask you about the role of sponsored content in Vancity Buzz's strategy. And as I understand, and as I'm sure lots of you understand, ad blockers are becoming really a big problem for digital media strategy. And at the same time, Vancity Buzz has been quite often criticized for the kind of sponsored content you've used. So what is your strategy going forward? And are you going to continue to use sponsored content as a big source of revenue, or are you going to try to move away from that?
Thank you for the question. I was wondering when sponsored content was going to get talked about. So to the last point, are we going to continue to do it? Yes. I think the difficulty is that we have a free product, and people want high quality product. And how do you deliver that when you have no one funding you? You're doing it all yourself, and you're trying to grow a team, and you're trying to get a better team, and you're trying to get better people on. And how do you do this? It's to get revenue in somehow. So for us, that's a large chunk of the way that we are able to sustain what it is that we do. I think I'm the biggest critic when it comes to our team, that our sponsored content has sucked in the past, and it's been garbage. And we've gone from a time that we wouldn't put disclaimers that it was sponsored. We progressed to there would be a little bit of, you would see a small disclaimer. Now there's disclaimers at the top and bottom. There's disclaimers all over the place, and we're still trying to become more transparent. And as we move forward, the issue of transparency is one of the biggest ones, because you want someone to be able to come to your publication and know right away whether you're reading something that was paid for. But at the same time, I also throw it back to our sales team and say, if you're going to give us sponsored content, and I know this is what we need in order to run the site, and I want to add on a new body, and this is how we're going to pay for that person, it has to be good content. It has to be something that aligns with the publication. It has to be something that, from a value standpoint, this makes sense. I was talking on a podcast recently, and the host asked me, would you take money from someone like Donald Trump? And I said, well, is it Trump Tower in Vancouver? Because that's different. We have readers that are looking for condos to buy. So in that case, I would have no issue with that, as long as it's done in the right way. But if it's Donald Trump himself trying to persuade Canadians or American citizens living in Canada who can vote, I would say no. So I think there's definitely a fine line, and that's something that we're constantly trying to get our team to get better at. And that if it's going to be something that we're putting in front of our readers, that it's something that's relevant. It's not our primary demographic is between an 18 to 45, and no offense to anyone, but we're not going to do ads that you see on CBC, because we're a very different reader, or a very different audience. I watch CBC every single morning, and I don't need a new bathtub or a walk-in bathtub. So it's different. You're not going to see. You're not going to see that kind of. You're not going to see that kind of sponsored content on our site. So it's moving in the direction that that it's better. And when you look at it, even though it's been paid for, even though it's sponsored, it's still good content.
Could I just add to that? We are doing more and more sponsored content, and that's a big part of my job. Sponsored content is here to say it is the new model for revenue and for monetizing media, because people don't want to see display advertisements anymore. Classified ads are practically non-existent. You know, whether you're free or whether you're charging nominal amounts of money for your product, you have to finance the payment of the people who are producing that product. And it's very big. Transparency, as Farhan says, is huge. You've got to label it. You've got to let a reader know when they're talking, when it's the reporters talking to them out of the newsroom on pure news, and when it is an advertiser talking to them through the story vehicle that is sponsored content. But everyone is doing it. All of the national newspapers, all of the post-media newspapers are doing it, Sun and Province, and Farhan's certainly not the only one who's heavily involved in it and dependent on it.
Sorry.
I was going to say, I think we're seeing the shift where people pay for content and now they want it free, and if you're hitting a paywall, you're going to look somewhere else for it. But I think we're slowly going back to a way that the only way to have good, in order to expect good content, is that it's somehow being paid for. So it's also then on the readers, and we get feedback all the time that says, why I didn't like this, why are we doing this, or why do I have to get this clogged up in my feed? It's like, well, do you want to pay for it? Because we have to have some way to get money to do what it is that you're coming to us for.
I'll reframe it just a little bit, because we had, I love a question that starts with, this is the elephant in the room, so I feel like I need to reframe something along the lines of what you two were talking about and see if our other panelists want to weigh in. But the elephant in the room question that came in electronically was, how does the pursuit of advertising dollars influence journalistic decision making?
I'll take that one. I'll speak as a former well-paid employee of the mainstream media. As advertising dollars get harder to grab, there are fewer and fewer large advertisers. The pressures from those advertisers are becoming more intense. And that's where I have a problem with the mainstream media. They need to be open and honest about what's going on behind closed doors, because decisions are being made to appease certain powerful advertisers which affect the news that you get. They won't admit to it. It's happening. Instead, they'll say, well, Farhan and his sponsored content is the problem. That's not the problem. People know that now. They know what it is. Young people know what to look for. The thing that worries me is what's going on, and this is out there.
I'm going to ask you for an example in a
right.
minute.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, one of the well-documented examples is the post-media example about the oil industry. Now, you may know more, so you can say more, but I only know what I read, and that was a document which purported to say that there had been discussions with post-media and the oil lobby to suggest that there would be shaping of coverage, more positive, or something other than, you're a big industry in this country, we're journalists, we're just going to cover you, buzz off. That's happening much less, I can assure you of that, because if you can get a large advertiser, you need that. If you open any major metropolitan daily today and compare it to what it looked like 10 years ago, the big full-page ads are disappearing. If you're Loblaws or someone and you buy a big full-page ad, believe me, you can make a phone call if you choose to.
I'm going to say
I need to respond.
You go for it.
You go for that.
You do it. You go for that one.
No, Farhan, I'll go after you.
Just straight answering the question, it's not. To us, if we have to ask ourselves this question, that are advertisers affecting what it is that we're doing, and we've had this conversation just days ago, is it worth it? Is it worth it to have that person or that company on board with us? I think there's a big enough sea out there that we can turn away business, and we have done that before. And we've said, no, it's not something that aligns with us. It's not something that works. Our readers are going to look at it, and they're going to know right away that we're getting bought out. So why would we do it?
And we turn away advertising away for the same reason. About oil industry interest, for sure Postmedia has talked to the oil industry, and the oil industry has been a huge sponsor of content and a huge advertiser with the paper. And I think there were discussions about some of that sponsored content. I, as a senior editor at The Sun, have never had any pressure applied to me about what to write or not to write. And if you look at today's front page, Petronas is again in the crosshairs because of the scientists signing this document that points out to the government that it's inadequate in some areas in terms of looking after watershed and fisheries and so on. And we did a series in The Sun, a 2-3-part series on Petronas and on its record in the rest of the world and in the Asia-Pacific Rim on safety and on environmental concerns and so on. So, I mean, I don't feel any pressure in the newsroom, but there are definitely discussions with the oil industry and many other very powerful groups who advertise and who buy sponsored content. And we write stories that we label that tells issues from their perspective. It's true.
Right. I'll give a quick personal example.
Okay.
I used to work for the Toronto Star. In the newsroom, it was known as an HCI. If you as a junior reporter, you approach an assignment desk. The assignment editor gives it. In those days, it used to be 5 carbon sheets typed out. He takes his sheet. He gives you the rest, and it tells you to go and do something. Usually, it was not very important, but every once in a while, the assignment editor would say, this is an HCI, which meant high corporate interest, which meant it came from the corner office, up a floor, or whatever it was, in the corporate wing. And as a junior reporter, it's usually some nonsensical thing, but what it meant was, do it even though it seems silly, because a member of the board is involved in this charity, or whatever it was. That just shouldn't happen at the country's largest newspaper. Now, that's a petty example of a bigger problem. There's supposed to be a firewall between the corporate side and the editorial side, but I'm telling you, it's a fantasy. Now, if it can happen on a little charity story, it can happen on a big story. And to repeat the wise Donald Rumsfeld, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what they're not telling you because someone made a phone call. That's the transparency we need.
Actually, that did happen to me. It's not new. I was business editor of the Oregonian late 80s, early 90s, when our largest auto advertiser had signed a consent decree with the Attorney General's Office for False Advertising. At the order of my managing editor, I took dictation from the publisher on that story. He wrote the story that went in the business section. I had a press run of real estate sections stopped after 80,000 copies because there was a story on how to sell your own home. And we had to sub out that story, put in a new story, and they hauled 80,000 papers to the dump. That was before recycling. And all this ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, by the way, so the word got out. I didn't leak it, but plenty of people, including me, were upset about that. So it does happen, and yes, it is an elephant in the room. It may actually happen less today. I mean, those were the days when we were making a ton of money, so I don't know why we caved into them.
Well, moving to the conclusion of this part of our discussion, and I want to just make it clear that there is a reception afterwards, and I know that there are questions left, and you'll be able to engage these guys in that conversation one-on-one during the reception. But I just want to put it back to, it was great to have a question reframed from the audience point of view, to say, you're all speaking to this from the point of view of the media, but what about us as the consumers of the media? I'll just ask each of you to weigh in just briefly as we conclude on what advice then would you give to your audience, to the consumer of media today, about how should they choose the most trustworthy source of information with everything that there is out there in the world? I'll go in the opposite perhaps direction that I did in the opening remarks.
It's evolving now. I mean, we've never had so much good information, actually. The problem is sorting it out. We've got tremendously interesting experiments going on now with Vox, which is a website that explains the news. All it does is report context. 538, which applies statistical methodology to politics, which is really interesting. In Canada, the 10 and 3, started by 3 statistics nerds who write stories based on Statistics Canada. So I think you're going to start to see some interesting things emerge, but in the meantime, you know, stick with the people you already trust, you know, and maybe I guess one thing I would add, just thinking about, I was thinking earlier about objectivity. I'm not sure this answers this question specifically, but you guys have the power now. You're in charge. You're in the driver's seat. You choose which media you pay attention to and don't pay attention to. We're up here talking about objectivity and ethics. I would like to flip that on its head. You should be telling us what's ethical for a news organization and what's unethical. I would like to see that be a grassroots movement.
All right. Also, what advice would you give consumers of media these days?
Look for track record. If I'm going to say something which is probably dangerous. My habits as a news consumer have changed. I used to read my newspaper, the one I worked for. That was basically all I read, unless I had to check something with another source. Now I'm the opposite. I'm more like the 18 to 45s, I guess. I'm grazing. I'm getting a story here, a story there, and I'm starting to figure out who I trust. For instance, the National Observer I like a lot because I'm interested in the oil industry, climate change and the tar sands and the things that are important to our country. They are covering in depth, and I know they have a point of view. I know they don't particularly like the oil industry, but I like their reporting and their investigative work in that area because I think they're telling me things I'm not hearing somewhere else. If I lose trust in them, I will go elsewhere to find it. But the best advice I can give you is graze. Don't be loyal to anybody. If someone does you wrong, jump, go somewhere else. And explore you mentioned Arctic deeply, Syria deeply. I love those deeplies because they're pairing in, it's a mix of things, but part of what they're doing is pairing experts with journalists or finding experts who can write well. Right. And so you're taking the middlemen out. And as a journalist, I hate to say take the middlemen out, but I should shoot myself for admitting this one. There's a fundamental flaw in the practice of journalism. It's based on the premise that if I talk to you as a scientist long enough, I'm going to understand your research. Well, if you've ever been interviewed by a journalist, you know it doesn't work all that well. You've spent your whole life doing that research. You get it. I'm probably not going to get it. I'll do my best, but it's going to be, now why don't you just write it? Why doesn't the audience just listen to you? I'm doing more of that because you're getting it straight from the horse's mouth. Again, there can be bias and all sorts of problems with it, but you can check that. And if I come to trust you, I'll stick with you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I like what Paul said about grazing and looking around. There's an awful lot out there, and unfortunately, I think what gets a lot of attention are those real screaming headlines and the 5 ways to this, and it's kind of like the difference between junk food and food that really sustains you, right? And what I find really, really troubling is when people say, well, I'm not going to pay for news because I can get it free on the internet. And, you know, I think what a lot of people don't realize is what they get free on the internet is an aggregation of the material that has been produced all over the world by well-paid journalists and journalists who are educated and who are working very hard for reputable news outlets every day. And some of them are even putting their life on the line, those foreign correspondents. And to have somebody regurgitate that on another platform in another part of the world and claim it as their own and to be credited with that being their own, it's really, really distressing to someone who does support mainstream media as well as other alternate media and startups as well. So I would just say graze and think about source and look for what is most reliable. And even, you know, in those fact-based news outlets, there you'll see point of view as well. You'll see entertainment, and you'll see the opinion expressed that sometimes will kind of feed your interest for a little bit of kind of rebuttal and tension. But just keep in mind that there really is no free lunch.
You started things off for us, and you get the last word.
Don't be ignorant to think that everything you read is correct. Look around and have multiple places that you're looking for information. You know, I think it's if you're thinking that everything you read is correct, everything you watch is correct, everything is right. I think then you need to have a check with yourself. Because it really falls upon you. What is it that you believe? What is it that you find ethically correct? Where do your values align? So I think it's kind of echoing the same statement here. It's having a bunch of different outlets that you're following. Everyone's going to give you information in a different way, and finding how you like it best and how you like to consume it best. Some people like those 5 ways to whatever, and for some outlets it works really well, and it brings people in to show that they have a lot of other content. But it's finding those outlets that you know you're going to get the full transparency on it. I think everyone is trying to get to that and be more transparent and show you what it's like. And you know, if we make a mistake, then we're going to tell you that we've made the mistake. And if there's a lot of publications, there's a lot of outlets that don't do that. So making sure that you're staying up to speed with how it should be done. And if you're seeing one do it and the other's not doing it, then drop that other one. But don't be scared to go back to them a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, because chances are they've changed, and chances are they've grown, and they're doing things differently. So, you know, just don't be stupid. It's kind of as straight as that. I see it all the time that people are sharing information, and this is the crazy thing. You're talking about sharing things on social. I just saw someone who shared something from like 2014, and it was like, oh my God, this just happened. And I said, that happened 2 years ago. So it really falls upon the consumer. It falls upon the reader that if you yourself are not doing the right things, if you are not being smart enough, if you're not reading into things enough, it's falling upon you. So each of us is a reader, each of us is a consumer, so don't make the mistakes, and just be smarter with how you're doing it. The information is more accessible than ever before, and it's going to continue to get that way. So if you have questions, don't just take it at face value. Dig deeper, and find the answers for yourself.
Great. Thank you all. I'm going to hand things back over to Fred Lee, but just before he takes the stage, I wanted to say thank you very much to all 4 of you. I'm used to being on, the other side of the microphone and just talking in people's ears, so you made it really easy for me to be up here, and I really thank you so much for all of the insights and opinions that you shared. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kathy.
Back to you, Fred, in studio.
Please, everyone, join me again for an outstanding panel and discussion tonight. Thank you, Karen, for being such a terrific moderator. And thank you to you. Clearly you were engaged. There were so many questions on the platform, and you've given me some additional thoughts as well, and hopefully we can share that with the panel. We did do an endeavor to get to as many as possible, and as Karen mentioned, we will have a reception where we can continue the conversation. I think this is where I adjourn and invite all of you to the conversation and reception that follows. I want to thank Scotiabank and the CBC for being our continued supporter of UBC Dialogues, and to the Irving K. Barber Learning Center for partnering with us tonight to tape this very important conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.